Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the Kootenai Conservation Program's Winter Webinar Series. This year, our series focuses on the theme of From Alpine to Valley Bottom, conserving essential habitats in the Kootenays. My name is Marcy Marr, and I'm KCP's Stewardship Coordinator, and I'll be the host for today's webinar. Nicole Trigg, KCP's Communications Coordinator, is also on board to ensure that our technology runs smoothly this afternoon. Given the rich heritage of stewardship in the Kootenai region, I'd like to acknowledge that KCP's work occurs in the traditional territories of the Ktunaxa, Shuswap, Sinixt, and Syilx peoples, who have lived here and stewarded the land and water for many generations. While some people are still joining us and settling in, I'll talk a bit about the Kootenai Conservation Program. We're a broad partnership founded in 2002 and currently comprised of more than 80 land and water conservation and stewardship groups, government agencies, resource industries, and agricultural producers working through the east and west Kootenays and southeastern BC. KCP's mandate is to coordinate and facilitate conservation efforts on private land and to generate the support and resources needed to maintain these efforts. We achieve this through increasing the effectiveness, collaboration, and coordination of private land management and stewardship activities, building financial and technical capacity of partner organizations, and serving as a network to achieve efficiencies, synergies, and ultimately greater effectiveness. Today is the first of 4 webinars, and I'm excited that we have such an excellent and interesting group of speakers to share with you this year. And before we get to our featured presenter today, I'd like to tell you about upcoming webinars. And our next one is on February 11th and will feature a provincial and regional overview of BC's old growth forests. Where are we at and what happens now? With Rachel Holt of Viridian Ecological, who will discuss the importance of old growth forests to maintaining BC's biodiversity and compare the findings of her latest report entitled BC's Old Growth Forests, A Last Stand for Biodiversity, with those of the province's strategic old growth panel regarding the future of old growth forests regionally and provincially. Then on February 17th, we'll feature Brian Churchill from Wild Site Creston Valley Branch, who will present how the Creston Valley Green Map was developed and is being used to increase local conservation awareness and opportunities in the Creston Valley. And to wrap up our webinar series, on February 25th, our speaker will be Ryan Durand of Ecologic Consultants, who will describe the Columbia Valley Wetland Mapping Project, combining digital technologies and wetland ecology. I'd like to review some information about this webinar. It'll be approximately 40 minutes with up to 15 minutes for questions at the end. As an audience member, you are on mute for the presentation. If you're not familiar with the Zoom platform, take a moment to locate your control panel by hovering your mouse over the bottom of the screen. Hopefully we're all pros at this by now. And if you have questions for Doris about her presentation, please use the Q&A box and type your question in there and they'll be answered at the end of the presentation. If you experience any technical issues, use the chat option and Nicole Trigg will be monitoring the chat box and do her best to help you. We will be recording this webinar, so it'll be available on our website. And you will receive a follow-up email with the presenter's contact information, a link to the webinar recording, and a short post-webinar survey. Your feedback is very important to us. It helps us shape our new series next year, so we look forward to your feedback there. And we are always very grateful to the funders and supporters of the KCP program, without whom we couldn't do these types of programs and webinars. So I would like to now introduce today's speaker, Doris Hausleitner. So Doris is a wildlife biologist with CPNE Ecological Consulting and an instructor of applied ecology at Syilx College. Together with her research partner, Andrea Cortello, Doris has been working on Wolverine in the South Columbia Mountains since 2011. In addition to working on Wolverine, Doris specializes in research and conservation of rare and endangered species and feels most at home out in the field. Today, Doris will speak about why female wolverine are vulnerable to disturbance, especially at reproductive den sites. And she'll describe her work finding and conserving wolverine denning areas and how her research team has searched for them using a combination of new technologies and citizen science. So thank you, Doris, for being the first speaker kicking off KCP's webinar series, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Marcy. I'm so excited to be here, and I really appreciate you asking me to kick off this webinar series. While I get my screen shared, I thought I would ask the audience in the chat box if you would mind telling me whether or not you have seen a wolverine and what you were doing when you saw it. So it seems like there are some lucky people that have seen Wolverine, and that's really fortunate because they are pretty elusive animals. So I'm going to kick off this webinar series. So the series is on conserving habitat from alpine to valley bottom. And really, there is no better species that can act as a poster child for the alpine. The wolverine is such a unique animal. It's really adapted to cold climates. They're really, if you think about larger animals, they're really one of the only animals that we have that's active in winter. And they've done this through adaptations. They have various physiological, morphological, and behavioral adaptations that they've relied on in order to be active in winter. So I thought I would start you with this slide just to be sure to let you know that Team Wolverine is a diverse array and talented group of individuals, and I am just one of them, and I hope that I'm sharing all of their stories today. You can see that amongst these individuals, Andrea and my family members are integral team members. So why should we care about Wolverine? Well, for one, they're incredible travelers, and a male has a range of about 1,000 square kilometers, and they occur on really low densities on the landscape, and so they're incredibly hard for humans to study. We just had, I just got word from Miriam, a collaborator who works in the Revelstoke area, and a wolverine that we captured in Yak, so near near Creston, I guess is the closest community, was recaptured 250 kilometers away in southeast Revelstoke. So they move like nobody moves on the landscape. A single male in Montana moved 150 kilometers in one day. This was from radio telemetry data. And if you move at that scale, you really have to think about conservation at a landscape level, which is really cool because if you conserve at that large scale level, all sorts of other animals will fall under in that umbrella. And one of the really ideal things about conservation at the landscape level is that it makes us resilient to climate change. And wolverines in particular, they need snow in order to den. We'll talk about that later, and in order to travel. And so they really are sensitive to climate change. And they have a real significance culturally. They feature heavily in the Ktunaxa creation story, and the Syilx and Sinixt people all have the term Wolverine in their language. And they have a reputation for just being a free mountain spirit. In British Columbia, they've been blue listed, and they are known as a species of special concern federally. They have recently been turned down for listing under the Endangered Species Act in the US, but that was under the Trump administration, and that ruling is now being contested in the courts. So I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about their cool adaptations. Because we are talking about a species that lives and plays and works in the alpine. Number one, to be active in winter, all winter long, they need to have large snowshoe-like feet. And this top photo here really shows that. They have what we call plantigrade motion, meaning that they walk on the soles of their feet, just like humans do. And another cool feature is that they have these retractable claws. And these claws enable them to climb trees, which you don't see a lot of other animals doing of this stature. And they use them like crampons on ice. They also have a really broad head and small appendages, and that enables them to keep warm. Their fur is thick and oily, and it has a unique capacity to shed frost. And this feature actually is what makes it the preferred lining on parkas in the north. This is a great photo. This is a friend of mine, Peter Mather's photo, and this shows the importance of snow for the wolverine. This is a female popping out of a den in the Yukon. So the skull of the wolverine is quite unique because it's robust, and it has teeth and muscles that enable it to forage on frozen meat and bone. So it can crunch through the bone to get to that nutritious bone marrow. And it behaviorally it's changed its foraging patterns to look for carrion. So it's a scavenger, and it looks for buried buried goats or other ungulates that are taken down by avalanches. And the carrion keeps in those avalanches just like an ice chest. And then when it melts out a little bit in the wolverines in the spring, the wolverines will gorge on that meat. Additionally, as this photo here shows, you can see this hole here in the right hand corner is what we call a food cache. And so the wolverine will, if they have too much, this wolverine was feeding on an ungulate carcass, it will then store it in this cache. And you can see that this is a cache and not a den, because wolverines like to keep their dens nice and clean, and you can see all the bits of fur and meat on the outside of this den. This cache. And so Andrea and I were thinking one day about Wolverine, and we were thinking about the Kootenays, and we realized that there was really a knowledge gap. So there'd been work kind of to the north of us in the Revelstoke area, and to the east of us in the Rockies, and to the south of us in the US, but there's a real gap right in the middle. And so we decided, it's almost 10 years ago, we decided to start in on the genetics portion of the project. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the genetics portion because it sort of sets the scene for the research that we're doing now. So we started again in 2012. So we went to 5 study areas over 5 winters. So the habitat and occupancy modeling that we do relates to winter use. Okay, so we set up our research to be collaborative because we wanted to make sure that we could answer questions across across the landscape with other researchers. But I'm pretty proud of this. Andrew and I were both sort of raising kids through this. So the fact that we covered an area of 23,000 square kilometers is pretty remarkable. If you kind of imagine this orange blob here as our study area, we put a grid on top of that, and we sampled. The grid is 10 by 10 kilometers, and we sampled every one of those squares. And we had just some real basic questions, like where are they and what makes them choose those locations? And we had no idea really how many there were. So that was the second piece that we really wanted to answer. So to do this, we used non-invasive genetic sampling, and we put our bait stations in trees. And the trees were then, you can see this tree I'm in here, it's wrapped in barbed wire. And what we're hoping happens is as in this photo here, a wolverine will climb the tree with the barbed wire, and their skin is thick and their hair is tightly attached. So only a few wisps of hair would be left on the wire. And you can see the reason the wolverine is climbing is because we have a chunk of meat here. We were doing all the foraging of carcasses along roads for many years, but this is why the wolverine is climbing. And in this way, we could answer a lot of really interesting questions without ever having to capture the wolverine. So less invasive and less expensive. Access difficulties, however, were pretty tremendous. I mean, if you think about that 23,000 square kilometers, there's a lot of terrain in there. And most of our sites were accessed by snowmobile, skiing, and helicopter. And occasionally we were able to drive a truck up to a site. And, it's funny, I'm smiling in this photo here with the snowmobile, but turns out I'm a terrible snowmobiler and got that thing stuck more than I didn't. Okay, so bringing you back to those questions. So where are they and why are they there? And the second one, like how many are there? And it's crazy after 5 years to boil it down to one slide, but I've done it. So basically, to predict where wolverine are in winter is not surprising. You need a food item. So this upper corner here, you can see our marmot. And marmot are really an interesting animal. So marmot habitat actually was our major predictor of where wolverine are going to be in winter. And they are likely a reliable food source for wolverines. And the Latin name for wolverine is gulo gulo, which means double glutton. So it's not surprising that food would be the #1 driver. Maybe a little more surprising is the fact that an anthropogenic effect was the second biggest predictor of wolverine in winter. And we looked at Forest Service road density, so not just roads that would be in the valley bottoms, but roads that would be on mountaintops. And you can see here from this infographic that if you have less roads, you have a more dense population of wolverines. And as your road structure gets more intense, like this bottom photo, you have fewer wolverine. And then finally, spring snow is a real predictor of wolverine. So spring snow is important because wolverine den in winter and they den in snow holes. And so they need this snow to persist well into spring in order to reproduce. And the interesting thing about these models is that they were even more of a predictor for females. So I've put these little pink hearts on these wolverine to show you that the females had the strongest models. So marmots, less roads, and spring snow is a very big predictor of female wolverine. Okay, this map here shows our study area with Nelson, the center of the universe here with the red star. And the darker the shading, the more dense the population of Wolverine, the higher the density of Wolverine. Overall, we found a very low density of Wolverine in this study area. Only 2 Wolverine per 1,000 square kilometers. So to put that in perspective, that's about 1 Wolverine for every 10 grizzly bears. And the interesting thing about this map, well, there's a few things. One interesting thing is that as you move further north, the density of wolverines gets bigger. Also, so these pink blobs here are provincial parks, and the green blobs are national parks. And you can actually see that the parks have a higher density of wolverine than the matrix area, the area where there are no parks. My colleague Miriam, who works in the Revelstoke area, also saw that wolverine densities actually decrease as you get to the edge of parks. So there is an edge effect. So these parks are doing a great job of housing wolverines, but there's fewer and fewer wolverine as you get to the outside of the park. So at this stage, after we finished this part of our research, Andrea and I really had to think, what could we do to really promote wolverine conservation? What one thing would give us our biggest bang for our buck? And so we kind of reviewed what we knew. We know that wolverine den in winter, and they have really low reproductive rates. So female wolverine start reproducing around the age of 3, which is late for a mammal. They typically only have kits every other year. They have the same as grizzly bears. They have delayed implantation. So if they don't have the stores, the energy stores, they won't have their kits. And then they only have very few kits, like 1 to 2 in a litter. From our work that we just finished, we knew that they need roadless areas so that they have some sensitivity to humans. And um, and we knew they need areas that had lots of food and persistent spring snow. Very few den sites were described in the literature at this stage. So we didn't really know what made up denning habitat. And so thinking about the fact that wolverines were super rare on the landscape, and we know that they like to den in, probably high elevation areas near tree line without roads. One thing we knew from the literature in Scandinavia is that there's a high fidelity to den sites, meaning that they reuse their den sites year in, year out. And interestingly enough, even if the mother no longer uses that den site, she often passes it on to her offspring. And we also know that wolverine are sensitive to disturbance, and especially wolverine moms, and they will abandon a den if people get too close. And so we decided to focus our conservation efforts on finding and protecting these reproductive areas. And so here's the second part of our research. We focused on finding dens because they're honestly in BC there were 3 described at this stage. And so we took our habitat modeling that we had done, and we decided to combine it with a great resource. We decided to use citizen science. We needed more eyes on the ground. So if there's only 1 wolverine in 1,000 square kilometers, how are we going to know where to start searching? So by reducing the landscape with the modeling and then asking people, where are you seeing wolverines? We then effectively decided to search those areas using a drone. And what we hoped would happen is then we would be able to find den sites and focus our management on those areas. Okay, so this is Andrea and I actually on our way up to Mount Plumin, and I'm doing an interview with CBC Radio, and it was so amazing. The Y2Y, Yellowstone to Yukon, helped us with the public outreach, and it's estimated in this every year we're reaching about 30,000 people. We have a website where you can report a Wolverine sighting, www.wolverinewatch.org. And we've been putting up posters at trailheads and hoping to catch particularly the recreation community as their eyes on the ground. And the citizen science has been pretty amazing. We've had 445 observations on our website between January 1st and August of this year. And these included 307 sightings of animals and 130 tracks. You know, we have to go through these sightings, and often we actually follow up with the people that have reported them to decide whether they are convincing, credible, or questionable, or even false. There have been some really interesting observations. For example, southern Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and some areas where wolverine are thought to be extirpated, such as Vancouver Island. We've had two over 2 different years, Quebec, New York State, and Michigan. And of those sightings, 34 excavations were reported, and 13 of those we believe to be potential denning areas. So to follow up with that citizen science, if the areas were close, we weren't going to Michigan, we would use a drone. And when we started this project, drones had never been used to our knowledge to search for animal tracks. And so we didn't know how the drone would fare in the winter. We didn't know whether, we would be able to see tracks. We had filled in an animal care form, and we had to fly the drone at 100 meters off the ground, which is quite high. So this little video just shows you the drone taking off. Oh, let me try that again. There it goes. So we learned a lot. The drone used about 4 batteries every trip, and each flight took about 30 minutes. And we found out that drones are pretty fair weather creatures. They have like a built-in avoidance function. So if it's snowing lightly or heavily, the drone tries to avoid the snowflakes. So we couldn't deactivate that, but we did find, if you packed the batteries with hand warmers, they lasted longer. We learned a ton in the first year. This little video just shows you kind of just to give you an idea of how high up the drone is. So like honestly, when it's 100 meters off the ground, it sounds a little bit like a mosquito. So the disturbance to animals would be very, very low. You'll see when I hit the play button, these two little dots are little skiers on the ground, and the darker black circle square is where we launched the drone from. And so this just shows you kind of an idea of what the drone flight looks like. So this red line in is just the ski approach. This is in the Valhalla range. And the yellow line is the transect that the drone flies. And the drone pilots can have the drone fly the contours of the land. So they're always 100 meters off the ground. And every every few meters, the drone takes a photo. So there's about a 30% overlap in the photos, but basically you can stitch them together and look at every piece of the land there. And there's a lot of advantages to that. The drone can fly about a 2-kilometer radius from you. And so you can get to areas that are maybe unsafe to get to because of avalanche conditions. And also you can you can go further than you would on skis in a day. We didn't realize how long it would actually take to search through images. It takes almost as long as it does to do the field work. And hopefully in the future, there'll be some sort of artificial intelligence created that can do some of that work for us. But if you look closely at this slide, I don't know how the resolution is on your computer, but you can see here is a Wolverine track. I'm just following it down this avalanche slope, and it goes across the slope here. And in this next slide, I've drawn over it with blue so you can kind of get an idea. But it was really amazing. We can distinguish a wolverine from a pine marten, from a squirrel, from a rabbit. It's really incredible technology. And after thousands of images, this is the type of image we're really looking for. This is about 70 hours after the last snowfall. And you can see that there's a concentration of tracks, and these smiley faces are just boulders with snow on top of them. And you can see that the tracks are going to those 2 boulders. Again, in the next slide, I've colored it to make it a little easier to see. So there you have it. You can see, so this is the toe of an avalanche slope, and these 2 boulders are a den complex. And when we found something like that, we decided to go back to every one of these sites, these excavations or holes where there are multiple tracks exiting and entering, and ground truth them. And what we're really looking for is the toilet, the latrine, because that is how we can confirm. So we're looking for that plus hair to confirm that it is indeed a wolverine den. This next slide is a little video, and you can see Andrea here. And I don't have the the volume up, but I'm just going to sort of talk you through what we're seeing here. And so you can see that this den site is actually the same one as in the slide with the smiley faces. It's the largest boulder in the boulder field. And it's in the center of a large talus slope. You can see as it pans around. This is a roadless drainage. It's right near tree line. It's very rugged terrain. But the den itself is typically on a shallower gradient, so at the bottom or the toe of a slope, as opposed to being sort of mid-slope. And it's a north-facing aspect, so there's guaranteed to be spring snow. So as I get into these last couple of slides, I just want to reiterate that these accomplishments have all been garnered through non-invasive means. So we have not, and I want to tell you about that, because with like Wolverine have these really thick necks and kind of a smaller head in comparison to their neck, and so they tend to slip radio collars quite easily. And so often when people do radio telemetry studies, they have to surgically implant the radio. And so to be able to find out this type of information without having to do that not only saves on cost, but is also, it's just not as invasive for the species. So just in August of this year, it was announced that there will be no wolverine trapping in Region 4. So up until this point, there has never been any sort of restriction on trapping. So this was pretty exciting, and this was as a direct result of our research. We have managed to publish 4 papers. One of them has been on pine marten, just incidentally. And last year when COVID hit and we were grounded because the helicopters literally were not flying, we shifted our focus and we've been working with the ministry to create management guidelines specifically for recreation and industry around wolverine dens. So bringing us back to the theme of the webinar, which is conserving essential habitat. We have been able to find 3 reproductive dens, and in 2 areas we know they're denning, but we just haven't found that hole in the ground. So that's 5 areas where we've identified reproduction. And these are areas where we can provide hands-on conservation for the species. In one of these areas, we created a voluntary closure. This was in a park, a 400-hectare closure in a popular recreation area. And this has been really successful. The closure was created in 2019, and the wolverine denned again in 2020. We've also applied for 2 wildlife habitat areas. And wildlife habitat areas are a conservation measure that you can use for identified wildlife management species. It's under the Forest and Range Protection Act. But under these guidelines, it sort of it protects that area from forest development in particular. And we've applied for 500 hectares in these 2 areas. And if they're approved, they'll be the first of their kind for the species for this region. Of course, no project can be completed without generous support. And we've had many, many volunteers on the project, and we can't thank them enough. And now before I turn you over to questions, I want to enlist you to search for wolverine tracks this winter when you're out recreating, and to contact us if you have seen wolverine and you haven't reported it yet. Even if they're old sightings, it's pretty cool to sort of look at the history of where these sightings are coming from. I would encourage you to report any sightings to www.wolverinewatch.org. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Doris. Great presentation and gorgeous scenery, hey? So we do have several questions, and I'll just go from top to bottom. The first question, do wolverines act as keystone species, similar like wolves?
That's a really good question. They don't have the same ecological role as wolves. So wolves are keystone because they're a predator. And, wolverines may have a really important role as well that we just don't understand, but they act as a scavenger. And so they're not keeping prey items at a certain level like a wolf would. So I kind of like to think of them more as an umbrella species, because if you conserve them, you're going to conserve everything underneath them.
Okay. Can wolverines hear the drones, and are they affected by the presence of the drones?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in our animal care application, we have what we can do is when we're flying the drone, we have a screen that we can watch. And so we can see what's on the ground. We can see what the drone is seeing on the ground. And so far to date, we have never captured a wolverine in one of those photos. But if we did, we could see their behavior and if it would change. But to put it in perspective, often I can't hear the drone. So it's a very small sound. And the Wolverine is not used to having anything in the air attack it. So it's unlikely that it would be disturbed by the drone. That being said, if we were to launch it near a den site, of course, our presence would be an issue, but that's the beauty of having a drone. We could launch it from 2 kilometers away and still get information on a site without having to be at that site.
Okay, the next one is, what type of vocalizations do Wolverines have?
That's a great question. No one's asked me that. Well, it's funny because I grew up in the Yukon, and once when I came back from ski touring, this Wolverine like burst out of this cabin. I'd been thinking about my blueberry bagels, and it had my blueberry bagels in its mouth, and it was snarling, like it was growling and snarling and just like nasty sounding. That's the only vocalization that I am familiar with, like kind of grunty, snarly.
Yeah, a lot of hissing.
Yeah.
Okay. Was an ortho-rectified image generated from the drone flights, or were you just analyzing individual photos?
That's a great question. You're obviously technically adept. Yeah, no, there are a few locations where we overlap the photos enough that we did do that. But generally that wasn't our purpose. And so we didn't have enough overlap to do that for most of our sites. We just analyzed the individual photos. But the cool thing about the overlap ones is then you can track, like, otherwise we're just saying there's a Wolverine track in this cell, but that way you can sort of see the whole track pattern as it moves along the landscape. But generally our batteries on the drones don't last so long, and so we were going for more area rather than better coverage of that, and more overlap.
Okay, we've got a geologist here with us. So what was the lithology of the talus slope where the video was taken? Those big boulders.
I have no idea. Oh my goodness.
Richard would know. So this was in Kootenai Park? Is that where you?
It was in Kootenai Park. Yeah, help me.
Okay, Richard, your turn to answer. Okay, while you're doing that, Richard, I'll go on to, question about where is Region 4 in terms of the jurisdiction?
That's a great question. Maybe what I'll do is provide a map for Region 4 so I don't put my foot in my mouth, but it's the Kootenai boundary area. But maybe I will provide a map afterwards so it's an exact map of Region 4.
Okay, great. Is the track pattern always the 3 depressions when they're traveling?
Another great question. So from my experience, what I see is when they're sort of in the 3 pattern, they're kind of loping, like it's an easier gradient. And then when it gets steeper, it often goes to 2s. So they're like, they're kind of lugging a little bit. And so the pattern will often be in 2s. So 3s or 2s.
Okay, great. So I've got a comment. This is so cool. Have you collaborated with the Wolverine research happening in Banff at all?
Yes, yeah, it is so cool. Yeah, we have, and in fact, the reason that Wolverine are no longer being trapped in Region 4 is because of collaboration with those folks, and that a paper that we published on harvest sustainability was in collaboration with those people. So our study area all of a sudden became really big. And we're just working on a genetics paper to look at how Wolverine are moving across these bigger mountains, and are there areas where linkages could be improved. So that's sort of the next step.
Okay. Oh gosh, questions keep coming in. So if folks can please put their questions in the Q&A box, not the chat. I see Nicole's trying to encourage you to do that because I'm just going down the list of the Q&A, and quite a few are queued up here, Doris. So I'll keep going. Um, Someone wants to know if roads are decommissioned or travel on them restricted, particularly in the winter months, might that enhance wolverine populations in area outside parks?
Yeah, absolutely. And really, when Andrew and I went into this, we thought that we would be finding a lot of wolverine outside of parks, and it turns out we're not, unfortunately. So the two den sites that we have that are not in parks, are, we can do some of that decommissioning of roads and maybe managing some recreation a little bit. But the ones in parks that generally don't have roads, so it's generally not an issue. um yeah, absolutely. So that's sort of what we had in mind when we dreamt of this project, is we'd be decommissioning and restoring habitat, and that just really hasn't happened because most of our wolverine are in parks.
Hmm, yeah, interesting. What's next for the Wolverine research for you? And will you continue with this current trajectory, or you pretty much considered your research finished now?
Yeah, so this season will be our last season of what we're calling drones and dens, colloquially. And then I think we really, like, I think with any research project, you have to stop and reevaluate and think about, again, where can we use our resources most effectively for conservation? And I think we'll be at that point after this year.
Great. And so regarding the drone use, was thermal imagery considered, or would the den depth, environmental conditions, etc., interfere with something like that? We're wondering about the feasibility of using drones for badger dens in the North Thompson.
Such a great question, and we've been thinking about that a lot. All the research that all the papers we've been reading have been used for grizzly bears or polar bears, and often in areas where the temperature gradient is quite different. So what this question is asking is, can you fly a drone and then get like a heat image of the den? And we were wondering this as well. It seems like there's a better thermal gradient if you would fly at night, but that would mean being in the mountains at night, overnight. And also in our area in the West Kootenays, we don't get those super cold temperatures. So I'm not sure how it would work. And we thought about maybe putting like a heated thermos or something in a snow hole and seeing how if we're getting any imagery. Wolverines also have really deep and intricate dens, so they're in snows or under with a structure like that rock that I showed you, that big boulder, but they're still buried in the snow. And then they can go like 20, 30 meters in any direction. So I'm not sure at the entrance if there would be that heat image. um, we've thought about it, and it would be super cool. And if you do get some success with badgers, please let me know. We'd be interested.
Great. Here's a question related to software. What software do you use to stitch images together?
I am going to take that question and I will ask my drone counterparts because I do not know the answer. Um, but yeah, I will get back to you on that one.
Okay. What application did you use to make the drone follow contour lines? And he's got a UGCS or manually?
It's not manual. We have done some manual tracking of Wolverine tracks. So sometimes when we go out, I don't know the software, and I will find it out for you as well. But that's pre-programmed. And so we've picked the polygon that we want to fly before we leave the office. Um, but on occasion, when we go out into the field, we see a Wolverine track not in the polygon. And so on those occasions, we'll just fly the drone following that Wolverine track and taking photos. And so we're looking at the screen to follow that Wolverine track, and then kind of moving the drone manually in that regard. But mostly we do the predetermined flights, because then we can fly that 100-meter contour safely, not lose the drone, and cover the area. But I don't know the software, so I will get back to you on it.
Okay, this is related. Did you learn to fly and collect the drone data yourself, or do you have an external professional conduct the flights?
You know, it's been on my list to become a drone pilot, because our drone pilots are amazing, but sometimes the access to get into these sites is kind of crazy, and so it would be good to have more people that like to ski ridiculous distances in a day, be trained up on drone flights. But at the moment, we're using Selkirk College and getting drone pilots from there. They're good at what they do.
Are snowmobilers threatening the Wolverine winter habitat?
Yeah, so how do I answer this? So I think so there's a couple of things about winter recreation. If winter recreation is predictable, so if a snowmobiler is always going up the same Forest Service road, and then, skiing in the same drainage or sledding in the same drainage, um, that's less of an impact for Wolverine. Same goes for a backcountry skier. If they're always in a predictable up track, or they're using a predictable area, that's easy for Wolverine to be like, okay, I know where you're going to go, so I'm going to den over here. Where it becomes difficult for Wolverine is when we're unpredictable in our movements. So if we go to an area that we've never gone before, and they've decided to den there just because of that reason, that is probably more disturbing. So yes, snowmobiles are an issue because they can go tremendous distances, and they can be really unpredictable in their patterns. Um, but every kind of recreation on the landscape has to kind of be thought of in combination, because it's not one thing, it's all of it.
Yeah, so here's another one in terms of their movements. What would drive a wolverine to cover more than 100 kilometers in a day? Is what you mentioned earlier. So what sort of drives them, the male and the females, to move large distances?
Okay, well, that's a great question. So the males have quite a bit of a larger home range. So I mentioned earlier in the talk, they cover about 1,000 square kilometers. And within that home range, there may be 3 females. And so one male has a little bit of a harem, and he has to go visit all his ladies. And that's one reason to cover a great big distance. The other might be for a prey item. So maybe there was a moose that went down, and the Wolverine cached it. Um, in his travels, in the Wolverine's travels, he might want to go back to that known food item. And then thirdly, I think this is what makes Wolverines so interesting, is I think they do a little bit of it for pleasure. Um, because you see, sometimes when you see Wolverines travel, and they go up these steep slopes, and they seem to be bagging peaks just for fun, like we would. So I think there's a little bit of that, just because they can.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we're going to switch back to drones. This is great. You're going to go from biology and and movements back to drones. So Felix Martinez Nunes said that he said I can help answer the stitching of images. You can use ArcGIS, Pix4D Mapper, QGIS R. These are common ones, and there are plenty of others.
Perfect.
For the person who was wondering about the different software and imagery. So someone's wondering, do you have to conduct drone recovery? I mean, probably, like, do they crash or malfunction, and then you've got to go search them out and find them?
So far we have not, but we usually carry 2 just for that reason. But yeah, no, so far we have not had to recover a drone, and I think the worst that has happened is it's sort of crash landed, and we've broken propellers, but no recoveries to date.
Okay. So for the dens that that you've discovered, are there plans to use cameras to look at reproductive success?
So again, like we've thought lots about this, and that's and I've it would be so interesting and so amazing. Um, but knowing that Wolverine are so sensitive and that they have such a great sense of smell has really precluded us from leaving anything at a den site. We have cameras up, um, nearby dens, and our hope is it's tough because the wildlife cameras can only capture a small image area, and so the probability of them catching the Wolverine and her kits are pretty low. But that's kind of where we've been comfortable going forward with. We're a little bit worried that if we did put something in a den site, then that the female just wouldn't use it. So if you can think of a way, I've been trying to like think of another way we could get that information without being invasive. If you have some ideas, I'd love to hear them.
Another question about females. So you said that females pass their dens down to their young, and would female siblings compete for a den?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, there's just so little known, but I imagine there could be competition for these prime locations on the landscape. We are really running out of roadless drainages. Yeah, if you look at the landscape of BC, it's kind of scary how many places we've gone into and what's left. So I suspect in the future that these quiet areas are going to be really a determining step for their reproduction, and yeah, quite possibly there'll be competition for them.
Mhm. And a related question about how much home ranges might overlap and whether there's conflict or competition that way that you might know about.
Yeah, really good question. The home ranges don't overlap much. And they're pretty good about scent marking. So they have special glands just for that, and they mark them. And that's another reason someone asked earlier, why would they travel that kind of distance? Is they're patrolling. They're patrolling the edges of their territory and making sure that no other male is coming in. And the females will do that within their smaller territories. They're about the third of the size of a male territory, but they also keep out competitors. But when I say that, there's also some really interesting information that's coming out that shows that wolverines will often travel with one of their young. So, like we'll see in our genetic study, we would see a male and his offspring at the same bait station. So we're starting to see these really neat family relationships that are much deeper than that we originally thought. They're not as solitary as we might think that they are.
Wow, that's really great. Well, thanks so much, Doris. You have fielded so many questions and done such a great job. So I just really, really appreciate you being here today. And thanks for all the great questions, everyone.